Imagine opening your eyes to the sound of church bells. Not the gentle call to prayer, but the dull, endless toll that announces death. Each ring means another neighbor is gone. You stretch in your straw bed, the smell of damp hay and smoke lingering in your nose. Outside, the streets are hushed, not because people are still asleep, but because most of them are gone. The year is 1348, and you are in the middle of the Black Death. In a single day, you are expected to go about your life, to find food, to see your neighbors, to maybe even pray for mercy. But already, your chances of surviving until tomorrow are slim. Before we dive deeper into this grim day, let me gently remind you, if you're enjoying this slow drift through forgotten history, feel free to like this video, leave a comment, and tell me where in the world are you listening from tonight. I'd love to know. Now, let's step out into the streets. The smell of death. You push open the creaking wooden door of your home. The first thing that greets you isn't the morning air, but the stench. The air is heavy, thick with the smell of decay. There are no trash collectors, no sanitation crews, no clean water systems. Rats skitter along the gutters, and where there are rats, there are fleas, and where there are fleas, there is plague. In a normal town, you might hear vendors calling out their wares or children running in the square. But here, silence, broken only by the slow rumble of a wooden cart. It's the death cart, pushed by men too weary to speak. The cart is piled with bodies, wrapped in coarse cloth or sometimes left bare, waiting to be taken to mass graves. The people pulling the cart wear cloths tied around their faces, soaked in vinegar or herbs. They believe it will protect them. It won't. Daily chores in a plague town. Even in the middle of a catastrophe, daily life doesn't stop. You still need food. You still need water. So you make your way toward the well. But here lies another danger. Wells are contaminated. Rats crawl in and out of storage barns, and your bread might have already been nibbled by a flea-infested rodent. Every bite you take is a gamble. Maybe you hope to buy something from a merchant, but merchants have fled or died. Those who remain raise their prices because desperation makes people pay anything. You see a woman begging for grain, clutching a child with dark swellings on his neck. No one dares go near her. It is a lonely existence. You are surrounded by people, but everyone keeps their distance. A cough in the market could scatter the crowd like startled birds. The appearance of sickness. Perhaps, as you move through the morning, you notice the small things. A headache, a little ache in your joints. Is it fatigue, or is it plague? You don't know, and that uncertainty gnaws at your mind. You glance at your arm. No swellings yet, no black spots. But everyone knows how fast it can strike. A healthy man in the morning can be a corpse by night. You walk past a family's home where red crosses have been painted on the door. Inside, the family is sealed away, sick and waiting for death. Neighbors avoid the house like a curse. Even their pets run loose, scavenging scraps from the street. Religion and fear. In these moments, the only comfort many people have is faith. But even faith is tinged with fear. Priests walk the streets, holding up crosses and chanting prayers. Some believe the plague is punishment for sin. You hear about groups of people who whip themselves in the town square, hoping that suffering will make God spare them. Instead, their bloodied processions only help spread the disease further. You duck into a small church for a moment of silence. Candles flicker against the stone walls. But here too, the air is heavy. Corpses lie shrouded in the aisles because there is no more room in the graveyards. The church smells of wax and incense, trying to mask the odor of death. The strange hope of survival. As the day unfolds, you may come across strange remedies. A man burning herbs in the street, convinced the smoke drives away sickness. A woman carrying a pouch of dried flowers, pressing it to her nose. Some rub onions or crushed emeralds on their skin. Others drink potions made from ground-up toads or mercury. Most of these cures do nothing, some even kill faster than the plague itself, and yet people cling to them, because to do nothing feels worse than trying, even if trying is hopeless. The toll on the mind. By midday, you realize the real danger of the Black Death isn't just the sickness itself, it's the constant presence of death. The anxiety, the fear, the knowledge that every handshake, every bite of food, every step into the street could be your last. You can't trust your body, you can't trust your food, you can't trust your neighbors. Even your own family could turn you out if you show symptoms hoping to save themselves. Nightfall approaches, and this is only the morning. By evening, the death carts will roll again. More bells will toll, more crosses will be painted on doors. The town shrinks every day, becoming quieter, emptier. As you lay back down on your straw mat at night, you listen for the sound of your own breath. Is it steady, or is it shallow? Are you safe for now, or is the plague already inside you? The truth is, no matter what you did today, no matter how careful you were, how much you prayed, how little you touched, the odds are not in your favor. You would not survive a day in the middle of the Black Death. Imagine waking in a medieval home. One grey morning, the wooden shutters are still drawn against the cold, the air thick with smoke from last night's fire. You pull your blanket tighter around your shoulders, but something feels wrong. The stillness is deeper than usual, heavier, as if the entire town has stopped breathing. Outside, there are no clattering carts, no cheerful calls of the fishmongers, only silence, broken by the distant toll of the death bell. You don't yet know it, but the Black Death is already here. The most terrifying part of this plague wasn't just the speed with which it killed, it was how silently it entered daily life. One day, the market was full. The next, entire families vanished behind closed doors, a red cross painted over their homes. Rats, fleas, and fear. The plague did not march in with drums and banners. It slipped in through the tiniest cracks, through rats scurrying on ships, through fleas hidden in straw bedding, through trade routes that stitched together medieval Europe like veins in a body. Nobody saw the real culprits, but everyone felt the terror they left behind. Imagine sitting at a wooden table in your dim cottage. You reach for a crust of bread, only to notice a rat dart across the floor. A harmless nuisance, you might think, but within its fur lives the flea carrying Yersinia pestis, the deadly bacterium. One tiny bite, and your fate could already be sealed. Villagers knew nothing of bacteria. They saw only the symptoms: swellings the size of eggs erupting beneath the armpits and groin, fever that burned away strength in hours, and the smell of death lingering in every alley. Daily life interrupted. The rhythms of medieval life, baking bread, tending gardens, carrying water from the well, collapsed under the weight of fear. Suddenly, the simplest acts of survival carried mortal risk. The well, once the heart of the community, became a site of dread. Did the water carry death? Was your neighbor's bucket tainted? Markets, once noisy with barter and laughter, grew thin as people avoided crowds. Bread grew scarce because bakers were too ill to knead the dough, or too afraid to touch customers' coins. Children, who once played in the streets, were kept indoors, clutching sprigs of herbs against their noses. Families whispered prayers at night, not knowing who would wake the next morning. The body as a battlefield. What made the plague so devastating was not just its spread, but the horror of watching it claim the body. The first sign might be a small swelling, just a lump you could press with your finger. Within hours it became an oozing, blackened boil. People stuffed herbs in their clothing to mask the stench. Fever made the body burn, while chills made it shiver. Victims became delirious, speaking to people who weren't there. And the bruises, the dark blotches that crept across the skin, were the most feared sign. They told neighbors, this one is already marked for death. The sound of the streets. Close your eyes and picture the soundscape of a plague-stricken town. Not the usual bustle of horses, vendors, and gossip. Instead, the heavy creak of the death cart's wheels. The muffled sobs of mothers behind closed doors. The low chanting of priests swinging censers of incense. The clang of iron as city guards lock the gates. The streets became theaters of silence punctuated by dread. Even the wind seemed to carry whispers of death. Faith and desperation religion became both comfort and terror during the plague. Some clung to prayer, kneeling before altars lit with dozens of candles, begging for divine mercy. Others saw the plague as God's punishment for sin and turned to extreme acts of penance. Flagellants, groups of men who whipped themselves in public squares, marched from town to town, hoping their suffering would atone for humanity's sins. The sight was both shocking and magnetic, half-naked bodies streaked with blood, chanting hymns as they lashed their own backs. For the average villager, watching such displays was both horrifying and strangely reassuring. If others could bear such pain, perhaps God would take pity on them too. Blame and panic fear needed a target, and panic made neighbors turn against each other. Foreigners, beggars, and especially Jewish communities were accused of poisoning wells. Pogroms broke out in several cities, leading to massacres that killed thousands of innocent people. In this way, the plague not only claimed lives through disease, but shattered the fragile threads of trust that held medieval communities together. Why you wouldn't survive? If you were dropped into the middle of the Black Death, survival would not depend only on luck. It would depend on a way of life utterly alien to us now. You wouldn't understand the herbal remedies people clutched, the incense clouds meant to cleanse the air, or the strange processions of flagellants. You wouldn't know which houses to avoid, which streets were safe, or how to recognize the first signs of infection in time to flee. And even if you tried to escape the city, the countryside was no safer. Villages slammed doors against outsiders. Travelers were beaten back from town gates with sticks. You could run, but there was nowhere to hide. Closing of Section 2. So, by now you might realize, you wouldn't last a day in the middle of the Black Death, not because you were weak, but because daily life itself had become a trap. Every touch, every sip of water, every breath of air might bring death. And yet, this was only the beginning. In the next part, we'll step deeper into the medieval nightmare, into the homes of families already struck, into the desperate rituals of healing, and into the chilling silence of towns where bells rang for the dead every hour. If you walked down a narrow medieval street during the height of the plague, you might notice houses marked with a crude red cross. Sometimes above it, the words were scrawled, "Lord, have mercy upon us." To modern eyes, it looks almost symbolic, a ritualistic warning. But to neighbors, this was not symbolism. It was certainty. It told you that everyone inside was already doomed. Imagine being sealed in such a house. The heavy wooden door barred shut from the outside. The town officials believed isolation would slow the plague, but for those inside, it was little more than a death sentence. Families waited in silence, listening to each other cough, whisper, and finally grow still. The progression of death, a medieval plague house was no place for the faint of heart. If you want to understand why you wouldn't survive even a single day, step into that suffocating darkness. The symptoms were relentless. At first, maybe only a headache or slight fatigue. But by the end of the first day, a child might develop a sudden swelling, a bubo, in the groin. The mother, terrified, would try to cover it with cloth soaked in vinegar or rosewater. The father might whisper prayers, holding a wooden crucifix to the child's forehead. But the swelling grew hotter, blacker, and more painful. Soon fever raged, skin darkened with blotches, and the body shook violently. Within 2 days, sometimes even within hours, death arrived. Now picture this. In the same small room, another family member begins to cough blood, and then another. The disease tore through households so quickly that grieving was impossible. Survival was a matter not of strength, but sheer chance. The care of the living there were no doctors in the sense we think of today. Physicians were rare and catered mostly to the wealthy. For the poor, healing fell to mothers, grandmothers, or local healers who used remedies passed down through generations. Some burned juniper or rosemary to cleanse the air. Others applied crushed onions, arsenic, or even dried toad onto buboes in the hope of drawing out the poison. A desperate parent might press a hot iron to the swelling, believing fire could burn away the plague. None of it worked. What it did do, however, was give people the illusion that they could fight back, however feebly, against the invisible enemy. The smell of the plague house, the senses inside such a home were assaulted at every turn. The smell was the worst, with bodies fevered and rotting even before death. The air turned thick with decay. Herbs were stuffed into clothing and scattered across the floor, not for beauty but for survival. Lavender, sage, thyme, anything to mask the stench. But nothing could overpower the sour, sweet smell of dying flesh. Visitors sometimes tied sponges soaked in vinegar to their noses. The family had no such luxury. Children and loss. One of the most devastating realities of plague houses was the number of children taken. Medieval families often had many children, but in a single week, parents could lose half of them. Imagine a mother cradling her feverish daughter, rocking back and forth on a straw mattress, knowing the child's breaths were becoming shallower, slower, weaker. The father, unable to save them, sat staring at the floor, silent tears, leaving streaks in the soot on his face. Survivors sometimes wrote that the sound of children dying, their cries fading into silence, was the hardest burden to carry. Abandoned by the outside world, neighbors rarely entered once a house was marked. Food, if provided at all, was left at the doorstep. Sometimes no one delivered anything, and families starved alongside the disease. Worse, some families were not sealed in but simply abandoned. People fled their own kin, leaving parents, siblings, and even spouses behind to die alone. Medieval chronicles contain countless stories of husbands deserting wives, mothers abandoning children, and priests refusing to hear confessions. When survival was the only law, love and loyalty often broke apart. The role of the church still tried, in many cases, to reach those trapped inside. Priests would stand at the door and murmur prayers through the wood, offering absolution from a distance. Some risked entering, and many of those priests died as well. Confession, last rites and burial were sacred in medieval Christianity. To die without them meant spiritual danger. But with priests overwhelmed, bodies piled up in homes, unblessed, unburied, forgotten. What makes it unbearable for us, for you, suddenly thrust into this nightmare? The hardest part wouldn't just be the disease, it would be the silence, the helplessness. You'd be locked inside with no medicine, no explanation, no hope of escape. Every cough could mean the end, every touch a death sentence. You would sit in the darkness, hearing your loved ones die around you, waiting for your turn. And perhaps the most unbearable thing of all, you wouldn't know why. There was no germ theory, no knowledge of bacteria or fleas, no certainty beyond fear and prayer. For a modern person used to answers, this ignorance would crush you even faster than the plague itself. Closing of section 3. So, if you ever wonder why you wouldn't survive even a single day in the heart of the Black Death, step into the silence of a plague house, where the air itself turned foul, where families vanished without ceremony, and where survival was little more than blind luck. But the terror didn't end at the threshold of those homes. In the next section, we'll step outside, into the streets, into the cemeteries, and into the mass graves where entire towns tried to bury the unthinkable. Imagine stepping outside during the height of the plague. The streets of your once bustling town are silent. No merchants calling out, no children playing, no hammers clanging from blacksmith shops. Just the occasional creak of a shutter in the wind, or the distant toll of a church bell that doesn't call you to prayer, but announces another death. In this section, we'll explore the collapse of public life during the Black Death. How marketplaces shut down, how trade froze, how people abandoned their own towns and villages, and how silence became as terrifying as the coughing from behind closed doors. You'll see why you wouldn't last a day, not only because of disease, but because society itself was breaking down around you. 1. The market that vanished. In normal medieval times, markets were the beating heart of every town. Grain sellers, butchers, fishmongers, potters and cloth traders filled the squares. But when plague hit, markets became sites of dread. Who would risk bartering with strangers when every handshake, every coin, every sack of flour could carry death? Chroniclers described once crowded plazas, standing completely empty, or only occupied by a lone official forcing prices down on essentials. In London, entire stalls vanished. In Florence, Boccaccio tells us, goods sat rotting because no one dared touch them. Imagine walking into that scene, no bread to buy, no warm meat pies, no jugs of ale. Hunger gnawed at your stomach, but stepping into the marketplace was as good as signing your own death warrant. 2. When trade collapsed, the silence stretched beyond the local market. Trade routes that tied cities together unraveled. Ships went unmanned. Roads were deserted. Carts that once carried grain, salt or wine now carried only corpses to mass graves. Venetian merchants stopped unloading foreign cargoes. English wool, usually sent abroad, sat stacked in empty warehouses. The Hanseatic League, the medieval trading superpower of Northern Europe, was paralyzed. For you, this collapse meant something simple: no food, no supplies, no escape. You couldn't order a cart of firewood or buy cloth for winter. And if you thought you could leave town, think again. Villages put up barricades to keep strangers out. If you stumbled down a lonely road, hungry and desperate, you'd be met not with charity, but with suspicion, and likely turned away at spear point. 3. Fear in the air. What was it like to actually feel this collapse? Imagine standing in the center of your town. Instead of laughter, instead of footsteps echoing from stone alleys, you hear only the buzzing of flies from shuttered houses. Instead of the smell of bread from ovens, you smell sickness and the acrid smoke of burning clothes. One chronicler in Siena wrote, "Father abandoned child, wife abandoned husband, one brother abandoned another, for this illness seemed to strike through the breath and the sight. So terrifying was it, that men thought it enough just to be near the sick to be themselves infected." That fear seeped into everything. Doors stayed locked, windows stayed barred, every stranger looked like a threat. Even your closest friends might refuse to meet your eyes. And if you dared walk out, if you brushed against a wall where someone sick had leaned, you'd carry that terror back with you. 4. A world without ritual. One of the cruelest parts of this silence was the loss of rituals. In the Middle Ages, markets and festivals weren't just about survival, they were about community. Marriages were celebrated in squares, saints' days filled the streets with processions, musicians played, children sang. During the Black Death, gone, no weddings, no festivals, no joy, only funerals, and even those grew shorter, more hurried, stripped of ceremony. Imagine planning to marry in spring, but finding the church locked, the priest gone, the town square deserted. Your feast of bread, ale and roasted meat vanished into the silence of hunger. Instead of celebration, you would be left waiting alone in a locked house, staring at smoke from plague pyres rising over the city walls. 5. The toll on the mind. The silence wasn't only physical, it tore at the mind. Human beings are social creatures, but during the Black Death, social contact was dangerous. Loneliness festered like the disease itself. Writers described people going mad from isolation. Children were left to wander the streets alone, calling for parents who never returned. Hermits barricaded themselves inside huts. The bells that tolled for the dead rang so constantly that survivors began to lose sense of time. If you lived then, even if you avoided the plague, your own mind might not survive the silence. Anxiety, despair, and superstition thrived. People began hearing phantom coughs, or believed shadows in the street were demons carrying the plague. This wasn't just disease, it was a psychological war, and you would have been fighting it without the comfort of community or the hope of medicine. 6. The end of trust. The silence of the streets also revealed something darker. Trust was gone. Merchants cheated customers. Priests fled their parishes. Rulers taxed the dying rather than help them. Neighbors sealed each other out. In some towns, if you left your home for food, you might return to find the door barred by your own neighbors, desperate to keep you from bringing death back. In others, guards patrolled to prevent survivors from looting the homes of the dead. You couldn't rely on anyone. Even your own family might push you away. Imagine begging for water from your brother's house and hearing only silence on the other side of the door. 7. Why you wouldn't survive. So why wouldn't you last a day in this world? Because survival wasn't just about avoiding infection, it was about navigating a society that had stopped working. You'd have no food to buy, no trade routes to supply you, no festivals to remind you of joy, no trust to lean on. The silence of empty streets would become its own kind of death sentence. You'd either starve in your locked home, or risk stepping into that silence, where every breath of air, every handshake, every coin exchanged might carry the plague. And when the church bells tolled again, echoing through the stillness, the town would know another house had gone silent too. Yours. Imagine this. You've survived the morning terror, the midday horror, and the endless fear of nightfall. But now, here in this final stretch of the day, you begin to realize the truth. The plague doesn't end. It doesn't relent. It's not a single event to endure and then move on from. It is a wave that never stops crashing, pulling you under until you simply disappear. For people in the middle of the 14th century, there was no after. The Black Death was not a bad week, or a cruel winter, or even a tragic year. It was a generational scar that stretched across the whole of Europe. And for those who lived through it, the daily struggle wasn't about survival into tomorrow. It was about surviving the next few hours, the next breath, the next prayer whispered under candlelight, the collapse of faith and order. By the final part of the day, when exhaustion set in, people began to look around and notice what had crumbled. The priests who once promised eternal salvation, many of them were gone, buried in plague pits beside the very peasants they once shepherded. The doctors, with their strange masks and remedies, their failures were written on every corpse-strewn street. Even kings and nobles who once seemed untouchable, like the King of France, who locked himself away in terror, were no safer than the farmer in the field. The social order that had held for centuries simply cracked under the weight of so much death. Entire villages vanished, families dissolved, guilds collapsed because there were no craftsmen left alive to continue the work. And if you found yourself standing in the ruins of your community at the end of the day, you might realize that you were alive, not because you were clever or blessed, but simply because chance had not yet turned against you. The loneliness of survival. What's worse than dying of the plague, surviving it, only to realize that everyone you loved is gone? Imagine walking through a village where the doors hang open, the hearths are cold, and the only sound is the buzzing of flies over hastily buried pits. This was the reality for many who lived long enough to see the plague recede. Survival wasn't a victory, it was a haunting. The friends who once shared meals with you were gone. The neighbors who once exchanged gossip over fences had been burned, buried, or abandoned. The silence was its own kind of torture, and those who remained often described their lives in the aftermath as lonely shadows of what they had once known. The last sight before sleep. At the end of the day, as darkness fell, medieval families tried to rest. But sleep was treacherous. Fever dreams, violent coughing, and the agony of swollen buboes meant that most plague victims never found real rest. Even the healthy lay awake, listening to the moans of neighbors through thin walls, wondering if tomorrow's dawn would come for them, or if death would slip into their homes during the night. Candles were burned low, sometimes kept lit all night in desperate hope that light might keep away the darkness of disease. But by now superstition and science had blurred together. A charm, a prayer, a slice of bread left at the window, all small rituals of hope that did nothing to stop the plague. And still, as the final hours crept past, fear held every household like a shroud. Why you wouldn't survive? Here's the truth. You wouldn't last a day in the middle of the Black Death, not because you aren't strong, not because you aren't resourceful, but because survival wasn't about strength. It was about chance, circumstance, and brutal timing. You could bathe daily, scrub your house, burn herbs, or carry charms, and still one flea bite was enough. You could lock yourself indoors, isolate, and pray, and still a cough from your brother might seal your fate. You could be a noble in a walled city, or a farmer in a distant hamlet, and still the plague would find you. This wasn't survival of the fittest, it was survival of the luckiest, and when the day ended, and the plague carried on into the next morning, very few people ever truly escaped its grip. The legacy of a single day. So why do we return to this story? Why tell of a day in the middle of the Black Death? Because it teaches us something about fragility. Civilization looks strong until it isn't. Faith looks eternal until it wavers. Families feel unbreakable until silence replaces laughter. The Black Death was more than a disease. It was a mirror showing humanity how fragile its structures were. A single day in that world was enough to reveal that survival is never guaranteed. And maybe, in that quiet reflection, you understand why you wouldn't survive, not because you're weaker than those medieval souls, but because no one truly could. Closing reflection. So tonight, as you listen to this tale and drift towards sleep, imagine the silence of a medieval night, broken by distant bells tolling for the dead. Imagine the smell of smoke and sickness on the air, the sight of shuttered windows, the uneasy quiet of families holding each other close. This is why one day in the Black Death was more than enough, and why, no matter how you imagine it, you simply wouldn't survive.